Anyone who knows anything about the Pacific War will tell you that life was hell for Japanese soldiers. Perhaps it was only worse for those civilians in the lands that they conquered, but almost nowhere was this hell worse than it was for the sorry souls sent to Papua New Guinea. About 200,000 of the 2.1 million Japanese soldiers who died during World War II died during the New Guinea campaigns. Of the 170,000 soldiers sent to New Guinea, 150 would die on the island. Across China, Indonesia, from Midway all the way to Burma, millions of Japanese fought and died. However, in New Guinea, death was almost a certainty, and the enemy's bullets were the very least of your worries. A saying in Japan during the war was, "Burma is hell. From New Guinea, no one returns alive." The impressive military victories of the Japanese Empire in the first months of the war turned out to be their downfall. They were far overextended, and after Midway, already weak supply lines began to disintegrate entirely. There was a Japanese plan at the beginning of the war that Japan would be resupplied by the lands that they conquered, not just for natural resources like oil, but also for food. By late in the war, they didn't really have any other choice. If you watched my last video, you'll remember how Nogi, the Navy man who acted as a colonial administrator in Indonesia, talked about how near the end of the war, half of his unit was just farming. But what happened when farming wasn't an option? When the actual war part of the war takes a back seat to simply trying to survive in the jungle. That's what life was like for Japanese soldiers in New Guinea, especially near the end of the war. It was a so-called green desert. All the food there had been quickly depleted, and there was no time to farm anything, of course. During the grueling retreats that claimed most of the Japanese lives on the island, things were so terrible on the island that death by insanity was one of the largest reported causes of death, and anyone who didn't go insane was just holding on by a thread. To quote from one soldier that we'll hear from more in the future, "I saw a man kill his younger brother. Love is such a cruel thing." That's what I felt then. The younger brother had gone insane, although he was the physically stronger of the two. The younger brother was cackling madly when we came upon him. The elder one slapped him across the face and shook him, calling out his name. He just kept laughing. Finally, the elder brother shot him dead. I didn't even raise my voice. The brother and I dug a grave for him. That is from the account of Ogawa Masasugu. We will examine his story later, but first I want to briefly spend some time examining other survivors, those who made the transition from New Guinea back to life in Japan. We kind of tend to see Japan pre and post-war as being completely separate from each other. And of course, if you think about it for more than 2 seconds, you'll realize that's not the case. That a lot of the same men who benefited from Japan's post-war economic miracle were the same who fought during the war. But I think it's important to, see how that explicitly functioned. In this worst-case scenario in New Guinea, how do you go from the nightmare of New Guinea to 1980s Japan with all of its glitz and glamour and talks that it might surpass the US in economic achievement? One of my favorite documentaries about post-war and wartime Japan is The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On. Its main subject is a 62-year-old Japanese guy named Kinzo Okazaki. Out of his regiment of 1,200 men sent to New Guinea, only 6 survived. Kinzo himself was taken prisoner by the Allies, and this led him to survive the war in Allied custody, so he missed the very worst of what happened, but his experience was definitely bad enough. It led to his life's work, bordering on obsession with political activism. He went so far as to even shoot a slingshot at Emperor Hirohito in 1969, and as a result was put in jail for a year and a half, only to get arrested again in 1976 for distributing, let's say, spicy pictures of Emperor Hirohito. And that's not even mentioning the guy he accidentally killed in the 50s that led to his 10-year imprisonment, but the movie kind of keeps that a little bit vague. In the documentary, you get to see what life was like for most Japanese veterans after the war. Cushy office jobs, modern homes with all the latest conveniences, and most importantly, a stable country filled with children and grandchildren who wouldn't have to experience war like they did. They get to enjoy all of the benefits of Japan in the midst of the post-war economic miracle. However, in this relative luxury, they seem to have forgotten what they experienced during the war, and the unspeakable things they did. It seems like Kinzo alone refuses to forget, or forgive those he felt were responsible for the war. He visits an ex-sergeant and fellow survivor as he lies in a hospital bed. After exchanging pleasantries and small talk, even bringing a gift, Kinzo reminds the man that his poor health is divine punishment from God. He believes that people like the sergeant don't deserve to live as if nothing happened after the war. He seems to think that Japan's post-war economic miracle isn't deserved, at least not for people like the sergeant, or himself even. When he's not chastising his fellow veterans, he's driving around in a car covered in radical political messages like "Kill Prime Minister Kakue Tanaka." In one scene during the documentary, he uses a loudspeaker to declare that he's holding a memorial for those who died for Hirohito during the war. He does not praise their sacrifice, but he refers to these men as victims of Hirohito and the other militarists. But to Kinzo, Hirohito is the main villain. To Kinzo, Hirohito is the one who deserves to suffer the most, and also the one who's gotten away with the most, still ruling in Japan for years after World War II, as if he had no involvement in the war. Through all this, Kinzo shows no shame or reservations about what he's doing. He does at times scream at police officers, and he's never without emotion during his political activism. In fact, he's often very angry. But the first time you see him truly shaken is when he stands before the mother of a fellow soldier who died in New Guinea, Shimamoto. As he pays his respects to Shimamoto, he explains to his mother that he was actually lucky, because he was the only one who got a proper burial. But as Kinzo tries to talk about the others who died in New Guinea, and the horrors that follow, he begins to break down for the first time in the film.
考えによっては島本さんがね、一番お幸せだったと思います。
So what really did he experience during the war? We hear about starvation from Kinzo, and the documentary follows him as he tries to get to the bottom of two mysterious deaths in his unit. It seems as if the documentary is moving towards a confrontation between Kinzo and ex-captain Koshimizu, who ordered the murder of a private named Yoshizawa, and one other, Private Nomura, 23 days after the war ended. However, I promise you that the truth is far worse than what you are thinking. While many of the other soldiers interviewed during the documentary claim that these two soldiers were killed for desertion, that's not really the truth. Nor were they just killed in a blind rage by some officer who had gone mad. No, they were hunted for food, or executed to cover up cannibalism that they were being accused of themselves. It's not really clear, and Kinzo gets so many different stories from everyone he talks to, but in any case, cannibalism was involved, and that's bad enough. But when you get a large group of desperate people together, it sucks to say, but the historical record is clear. People kind of start eating those who die of natural causes. That being said, hunting human beings for food is another thing entirely. The first to admit to this is a kindly-looking ex-medic taken from his family's little ramen shop. Of all the people I would expect to be an ex-cannibal, it's not this dude. I mean, look at him. Look how adorable this guy is. You know, I want him to be my grandpa. However, while he assures that he never ate a Japanese soldier, he claims that they all ate, quote, white meat and dark meat. They called the native people of New Guinea black pigs, and white people white pigs. The Japanese were also white pigs, but this guy just talks about white people and New Guineans. Which strikes me as even more messed up, that even when they're talking about hunting human beings for food, they retain these racial designations. It's like an unholy marriage of racism and cannibalism. Black pigs were apparently more acceptable to eat, and according to the accused ex-captain Koshimizu, an official order was given allowing for the killing and eating of so-called black pigs, while white pigs were prohibited, while others say that cannibalism was prohibited entirely. It's clear that it happened, and that native people were targeted specifically because they were believed to be racially inferior. And of course, when we talk about official orders around cannibalism, it probably shouldn't be assumed that this was coming from Japanese high command. This was probably an order from some higher up on the island itself. The Japanese military as a whole was a crazy and evil institution, but I don't think that they would have considered cannibalism to be acceptable at the top levels. That would have been at least against their own sense of moral superiority. However, one of the ex-soldiers that Kinzo talks to, the one that he said deserved to be sick because of what he did during the war, says that they didn't really eat native people because they were too fast, but in reality they only killed their own. Troublemakers and selfish soldiers, he says. They would become white pigs, quote unquote, for the rest of the dying men. Suddenly, all of Kinzo's erratic behavior seems to make total sense. When he beats up men for refusing to answer his questions, when he tells a man in the hospital that he deserves sickness because it's a divine punishment from God, all this seems to fall right in line with the gravity of the situation. Considering how extreme things were in New Guinea, this almost seems like a light touch. However, even if you go in from the start rooting for Kinzo, it's hard not to see that he's a little bit unhinged. However, after learning what the others did, and seeing how they try to ignore it and act as if nothing happened, you can't help but think that it's Japanese society that's gone mad by denying reality and trying to get others to forget the past. Kinzo seems to be the only person that's acting appropriately. But I don't think that conclusion is entirely correct either. Many of these men did eventually admit to what they did during the documentary, after a lot of coercion, of course. And also, who can blame them for being a bit apprehensive? I mean, they had a bunch of cameras shoved in their face, and they're asked to talk about, like, the worst moments of their lives. This isn't, justifying it, but I definitely kind of understand. And also, Kinzo is a bit unhinged. It's kind of impossible to discount that completely. The documentary ends with an epilogue talking about how Kinzo tried to kill the ex-captain, only to fail to find him and then shoot his son. The documentary lets us know that Kinzo's been sentenced to 12 more years in prison, and the entire time Kinzo makes allusions to his rather extreme religious beliefs about divine judgment, but we've already talked about that a bit. Really, I don't think it's too much of a reach to say that everyone who was involved in the campaigns in New Guinea was horrifically scarred by the war in their own way. This doesn't justify their actions, either the forgetting or the attempted murder, here, but I think it makes it maybe more understandable, if not justifiable. It makes sense that some people might want to forget their past. I don't think they should forget something like that. I think it's something that Japanese society should reckon with, but things got a lot better after the war. It got easy for everyone to forget. But it's also understandable that someone would devote the rest of their life to making sure that no one forgot, that they would spend every waking moment trying to get some kind of restitution for what happened, even going to prison over and over. Of course, as a student of history, I kind of have to wag my finger at Kinzo. It's really not a good idea to use violence to coerce information out of people. I mean, that's not how you get a good oral history. You're never ever going to get anywhere close to the whole truth that way. But of course, to Kinzo, this isn't just about history. This is about preventing another war and letting people know how bad it really was. And to him, this isn't some theoretical anti-war sentiment. It was a matter of life and death. So to him, violence seems like an appropriate response. However, people who are willing to speak are almost always going to give you a more accurate depiction of what actually happened. Of course, all people lie, all people misremember, all people kind of want to bend the truth to make themselves look better. But this doesn't change the fact that willing accounts of terrible stuff like this are far more reliable. So for the rest of the video, let's go through one of those accounts of the survivor Ogawa Masasugu, a member of the 79th Regiment sent to New Guinea in January of 1943. His regiment was harried by Australian and American forces as part of Operation Cartwheel. He fled through the jungle as part of Japan's fighting retreat, as it was called. Of course, escape to the home islands would have been unthinkable at the time, and there was no better supplied position to fall back to. Really, it was just a desperate flight into the jungle, into even greater danger, with no real end in sight. Of the 7,000 men, including reinforcements, sent to his regiment, only 67 survived the war. I mean, I think I need y'all to understand how crazy that is. Like, 30% casualties is considered absolutely devastating. 50% is like world-shakingly, historically terrible battle. But 7,000? Only 67? You might be able to find a battle or a campaign with similar numbers during World War II, but I don't know about it. I mean, maybe you do. Please let me know in the comments. That definitely also deserves another video. During the retreat, Ogawa marched through a hellscape. They were near the back of the retreating forces, so rotted bodies and others swollen and purple lined the trail. They'd have been stragglers who were too weak to carry on in front of them. Their boots and clothing were usually stolen by others. But still, Ogawa marched through the jungle. Lacking food and energy, they kept up regardless, only to find that they were abandoned by the Japanese army. A suspension bridge overlooking a gorge had already been blown up by the retreating Japanese forces, leaving Ogawa and his men to find another way around, marching months and months more than they needed to. They were essentially left to die, but still they kept going, lost in an unfamiliar jungle, all this because they were one day late to the bridge. In the first 2 weeks after the bridge blew up, Ogawa encountered members of the Kempeitai, the military police, stationed along the trail to direct stragglers. They still demanded salutes from the men. Ogawa kind of found this infuriating, but he didn't say anything, of course. Ogawa encountered one on the trail once. Some dude, younger than he was, barking orders at him. Ogawa had been marching with one other soldier who had fallen behind a bit. Ogawa had decided to slow down to let the man catch up, but the Kempeitai told him it'd be better to just kill the man and go faster. Ogawa was, of course, haunted by this and refused, but after 2 weeks the Kempei weren't a problem anymore because they stopped showing up. That might have been because how dispersed all the soldiers were wandering through the jungle. Half had gone insane, yet they all marched in the same direction. Yet despite all the chaos and disorder, men were still executed for desertion. They were told to report back to a superior officer, and they didn't in the right amount of time, they would be executed. It didn't matter if they got lost, if the officer went somewhere else and they couldn't find him. Everyone was lost, but if you got lost to the wrong person in the wrong place, you could get executed for pretty much nothing. The heat and humidity were unbearable. Guns rusted, iron rotted, and wounds seemed to refuse to heal. They marched even at night in total darkness, running into trees with unsure footing. The constant rain may have helped with the dehydration, but it made every other aspect of the march feel like a wet hell. Streams would flood in minutes, drowning anyone who was close to the banks. Sometimes it rained so hard it would choke you if you didn't cover your nose. Losing men wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes they would just flop down to rest for a moment, and when they all decided to move again, one man would say, "Let me rest a little longer," and then they would leave him and never see him again. Of course, men died in battle and were killed by the enemy that pursued them through the jungle, but that was the exception, not the rule. Ogawa says that he hardly even ever saw the enemy in New Guinea. It all seemed to be artillery and airplanes to him, or other types of death. To quote him, "We didn't know what was killing us. Who killed that one? Was it death from insanity? A self-unaliving? A mercy killing? Maybe he just couldn't endure the pain of living. Once, as I was trudging along, a soldier by the road caught my eye. He had lost his voice. He just pointed at my rifle and, with a bent finger, signaled that he wanted me to pull the trigger. I couldn't. while other Japanese soldiers treated native people terribly, even hunting them for food like we already talked about. Ogawa relied on them to survive. They gave him food and even saved his life by giving him medicine after he had collapsed on the trail. Ogawa seems to think that the relationship between Japanese soldiers and New Guineans was mostly positive. I think his experience is unique in that respect, or maybe he was exaggerating, because other historical accounts tell a very different story. But at least in Ogawa's case, kindness prevailed. Ogawa says that he never engaged in cannibalism in New Guinea, but it is something he encountered pretty often. As he put it, the extremes of existence could be reduced to the human stomach. While Ogawa ate lizards off trees and fought others for just a small bite of worms they had dug up from the dirt, he did come across bodies with muscles stripped away. After a while, he began to be terrified of Japanese soldiers that he didn't know personally. He kept hearing stories about how there were others who were hunting stragglers for food. In other places in Japanese-occupied Asia, maybe such rumors could be ignored, but not New Guinea. Once, Ogawa and his group were approached by a group of unfamiliar men in the forest, who offered to share the meat of a quote-unquote large snake with them. Despite their own hunger, Ogawa and his group refused. They thought that if it really was a snake, they wouldn't be offering to share, and that these men wanted to implicate Ogawa and his group in cannibalism. Ogawa saw the two extremes of humanity in New Guinea. While he feared being hunted by his fellow soldiers, he also saw others on death's door give away their last bits of rice. And after collapsing several times on the trail, he'd be carried by men almost just as weak as he was to safety. Of the 261 men in Ogawa's company, he was the only one who boarded a ship back to Japan. Accounts of war are almost always horrific, but reading the account of those who survived through New Guinea seems like some kind of fictional journey through hell more than a historical account. Ogawa chalks up his own survival to blind luck. In the end, he wasn't even thinking about surviving or even the next step, but he lived. Ogawa experienced something that not even other Japanese soldiers could entirely relate to. A horror that's so terrible it almost seems like fiction. And what can we learn from that now? I mean, of course New Guinea is a spectacle, and I've relied on that spectacle here in this video, but if we're going to take some kind of greater lesson from it, I hope that you can see again that even in the context of large histories where usually people are grouped together as Japanese or American or Australian, people respond to horrific situations in very similar but also very different ways. You know, there were large groups of men who all independently decided to start doing cannibalism, but there were also those who decided to give up their last bits of food or act selflessly in the face of death. I mean, people are really strange, and as students of history, that's something that we can't always really account for, but I still think it's something we shouldn't lose sight of, and it's very important. Alright, well, thank you for sticking through this video if you have. I still do have that better, more well-researched video coming up in a few months. I just wanted to make something shorter to put up on the channel until then. Please like and subscribe if you're interested. You know, more videos on the way.